Hello, I'm Justin Garcia with NGen, and today I'm going to be discussing secular biblical sources. These are sources that are found outside of the Bible that confirm the things that we know as truth within the Bible. If you look in the details below the video, you'll see a link to the text where you can read along with me, and I'll also be posting the text on the screen. Our first source is Cornelius Tacitus. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Tacitus is probably the greatest historian and one of the greatest prose stylists who ever wrote in the Latin language. And what he wrote is absolutely critical for the student of New Testament historicity. He wrote, quote, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." So what does this text mean to us, and what can we take away? We see first and foremost that Christ was crucified during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate, which is documented well within the New Testament. We also see that early Christians were hated to the point that they were tortured and martyred simply for their faith. The New Testament mentions Pilate 55 times and Tiberius once, showing that these texts correlate in a way that reflect actual events in history. Our next writer is Bar Serapion, a pagan Syrian philosopher who wrote a letter which most scholars date to 73 AD. In the letter to his son, he writes, "For what benefit did the Jews obtain by the murder of their wise king, seeing that from that very time their kingdom was driven away from them? For with justice did God grant a recompense. The Jews, brought to desolation and expelled from their kingdom, are driven away into every land." In this excerpt, we see that the Jews killed the Messiah. The Jewish kingdom was brought to desolation and the Jews were expelled. The Ark of Titus memorializes the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred shortly after the crucifixion. The monument still stands at the Roman Forum, a short distance from the Colosseum, and contains an intricate mural of Roman soldiers plundering the temple at Jerusalem, carrying in their spoils a menorah, which is not related to any other religion or culture in the world. This document by the Syrian philosopher shows how the world around Israel had a perspective that the destruction of Jerusalem was a direct result of the Messiah's crucifixion. Our next primary source is named Phlegon, and he was a Greek historian from around 100 to 200 AD. Phlegon's Chronicles are a very famous work that were quoted extensively throughout history. Unfortunately, the original writing has been lost and only survives in the quotations of others. The quote we will read is specifically from the early Christian apologist Origen's book, Contra Celsus, passage 214. However, if you follow the link in the description, you'll be linked to a large list of sources that quote various parts of Phlegon's Chronicles. Origen writes, "Now Phlegon, in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Christ a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions." Here we see that the Greeks believed Christ was a real person, and not only that, but also he was a prophet whose predictions came to pass accurately. Origen also states in passage 259 that Phlegon in his 14th Chronicle mentioned the crucifixion during the reign of Tiberius with an earthquake following after. Next up we have Pliny the Younger, a Roman magistrate from 111 through 113 AD, who is famous for the letters that he wrote. One of these letters was written to the Emperor Trajan, and I highly suggest reading the fullness of this letter by following the link in the description because it contains a ton of insight into the lives of early Christians, specifically into the trials which Rome placed on them. Pliny wrote, "They were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so,
When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Here we see that the early Christians met on a fixed day we call the Sabbath, praising the Messiah as God. The believers made oaths to live righteously and dine together after worshiping. The entirety of the letter, which is only a couple pages long, speaks of how Pliny had dealt with the Christians, putting them to death for their faith. And in the letter he asked Trajan if his treatment of them was proper, and Trajan's response is also recorded in history. He said that Pliny was doing well in handling the case. Here we have a witness of the existence of the Christian church and their faith that cannot be removed from the history books. Our next source is Flavius Josephus, a renowned historian of the 1st century who recorded the events in and around Israel. He was given special treatment by the Roman emperor as a translator, and his records are highly regarded by scholars of history. In the Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, he writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day." Here we see the Messiah mentioned by name, as a wise man and a doer of wonderful works. Wonderful literally means hard to understand, and it reminds me of the Old Testament messianic prophecy of Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, when the Messiah is called Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Mighty God, and Prince of Peace. We see furthermore that the Messiah was condemned to the cross, but that his followers continued believing on him because on the 3rd day he appeared to them, fulfilling the prophecies. What an amazing record of the Messiah, and what a blessing it is that we have so many sources from outside the Bible to confirm the truth within. Next up, might raise a question as to why this list is called secular biblical sources, as a religious text can hardly be called secular, but I included it because it is actually written by the same people who crucified the Messiah and who rejected him. These people are the Jews, and this quote is from the text regarded as the foundation of their religion, the Babylonian Talmud. In Sanhedrin 43a, it's written, "On Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene after they killed him by way of stoning, and a crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming, 'Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, inciting people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray.'" Being written by the very enemies of the Messiah, they very well would have done their best to erase him from the history books. But that could not be done. Even they acknowledged he really did walk the earth, and they record that he was killed on Passover Eve, just as the New Testament describes thoroughly. The quote also describes that the Messiah did amazing works that the Jews called sorcery. This very conviction is explained in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 12, verse 24, when the Jews said the Messiah was casting out devils in the name of Beelzebub, the prince of the devils. This event is also recorded in Mark 3:22 and Luke 11:15. The fact that these stories line up so perfectly is a prime witness to the Old Testament prophecy of Isaiah 53, when we're told that the Messiah would be rejected by his own people. Once again in the Babylonian Talmud, in Sanhedrin 107b, the Messiah is called a sorcerer. Our last witness is a Christian apologist who lived from 100 to 165 AD. His conversations with the non-Christian world are recorded thoroughly, and this quote will be further witness to the heresy quoted in the Talmud, and that it was in fact the opinion passed down from the ones who yelled at Pilate to crucify the Messiah. Justin Martyr, in speaking to Trypho the Jew, says, "This Christ, who also appeared in your nation, and healed those who were maimed, and deaf, and lame in body from their birth, caused them to leap, and hear, and to see by his word. And having raised the dead, and causing them to live by his deeds, he compelled the men who lived at that time to recognize him. But though they, the Jews, saw such wonderful works, they asserted it was magical art, for they dared to call him a magician and a deceiver of the people." This war of faith is actually Israel warring against itself. The true believers in the Old Testament are the ones who understand the Messianic prophecies and how thoroughly the Messiah fulfilled those, including being betrayed by his own people and pierced through his hands and feet, as David prophesied in Psalm chapter 22. Sadly, throughout the past 2,000 years, the world has made war against the Messiah. The pagans have continued to exalt science as if it had all the answers, and the Jews continue to repeat their denial of the truth, that the prophecies of the Passover lamb sacrifice was fulfilled, and that we have salvation thanks to the blood that he shed on the cross. Not only that, but that we have part in the promise he sealed when he defeated death. When he rose from the grave, he extended that promise to all of us who would accept the true purpose of our existence in this world, to seek the one true God who preserved his testimony throughout all the histories in so many ways. Now we see, according to these secular sources, the Messiah did exist. He performed miracles. He did die. He did show himself alive on the third day to his followers. His prophecies came true, and his testimony was recorded thoroughly in so many ways. We're so blessed to have the opportunity to study all of these manuscript evidences, but it's my faith that all we really need is wrapped up in a collection of books we call the Bible, and I encourage you to read it and to know the truth. If you ever have any questions or just want to talk about your faith, don't hesitate to contact us at missionandgen@gmail.com. That's no spaces, missionandgen@gmail.com. God bless you.